The snow had been falling since before dawn, quiet and relentless, blurring the pines into ghosts and turning the wind into a voice that wailed down the hollows. Kasia Briggs leaned her weight into the bundled canvas sack strapped to her back, what little deadwood she'd managed to scavenge before her fingers went stiff. Her boots had holes in the soles. The heel of her right foot was already blood-wet inside the wool sock she hadn't had time to darn. Behind her, 3 small shadows followed in silence: Trilly, Flora, and Marnie, each wrapped in patchwork quilts too thin for the cold, dragging sticks like dolls, cheeks pinked raw by the wind. They didn't complain. At 4 years old, they knew the price of speaking when there was nothing to offer. The only sound came from the wind and the rhythmic squeak of Kasia's steps across the ice-slick trail. They were almost to the bend that led to their little cabin, half stone, half shame, when Trilly stopped. She pointed into the clearing with mittened hands stiff as bark. "Mama," she whispered. "What's that?" Kasia squinted past the flurry. At first, she thought it was a bear until she saw the stillness, the way the body had curled in on itself, as if trying to become smaller than death. A man lay in the snow, part buried in drift. His dark coat was ripped open at the seams, revealing a crimson shirt soaked through, and his horse was gone. Snow clung to his lashes. "Girls, stay back," she said, setting down the sack. But the girls did what all children did when told to wait: they moved closer. Kasia knelt beside the man. His skin was sundark, jaw unshaven. Braids half frozen to the collar of his coat. One hand was stiff against his ribs. The other had clawed into the dirt beneath the snow. Apache, likely. No one else wore beaded leather over a wool shirt stitched with silver thread. She hesitated. Townsfolk didn't speak kindly of Apache men. Especially not the rich ones. Especially not ones with blood on their clothes and bullets in their legs. But he was breathing. Barely. "He's cold," Marnie whispered, crouching beside her mother. "He's breathing cold." Kasia touched his neck, then his forehead, burning. His lips were blue. He'd be dead before sundown. She looked at her daughters. She looked at the firewood she'd spent 3 hours dragging through the valley. She looked again at the man. And then, without a word, she hooked her arms under his and started pulling. The trip home was slower, heavier, carved with effort and breath that turned white in the air. When she reached the cabin, she kicked open the crooked door, snow blowing in ahead of her, and dragged the man across the threshold. The floorboards groaned as she eased him beside the hearth. There was no more fire. Just embers. "Girls," she said, voice low. "Blankets. All of them." They obeyed, piling quilts and coats over the man until he looked like part of the earth again. Kasia set her last match to the kindling. The flame caught slow, shy against the damp logs. When she looked at the man again, his eyes were open. Not wide, just slits. His gaze met hers and held. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile either. "You're not dead yet," she said simply. "That's all I know." He tried to speak, but only a cough came. She pressed a tin cup of melted snow to his lips. "Sip. Don't breathe deep. Fever's strong." That night, the wind whistled through the boards, and the girls slept in a pile at the man's side, their small bodies warming his legs and chest without question. Kasia sat by the fire, sewing the hem of a sock she'd mended twice already. Her eyes kept going to the man's boots, fine leather, Apache beadwork, soles thick enough to walk 10 winters. She could sell them. She didn't. By morning, he was still alive. The cabin stank of pine sap and melted snow. The man had drifted in and out of sleep, muttering in a language Kasia didn't recognize. She sat on the floor, stirring thin porridge from dried root and a scoop of crushed oats. Her stomach groaned loud enough for the girls to hear, but she ignored it. "Mama," Flora whispered, "can we keep him?" Kasia looked over. The man's eyes were closed again, but his chest moved like wind through long grass, slow, steady. "He ain't a dog," Kasia said gently. "He's warmer than a dog," Marnie added. "Don't need another mouth to feed," she muttered, mostly to herself. But she rose, crossed to the stranger, and checked his wound. The bandage, cut from her old petticoat, was soaked red. She undid it, saw the hole just below his ribs, and hissed through her teeth. Infected. She'd need herbs. She had none. He stirred. Water, he rasped. She brought it. He drank. A long pause, then, name's Nima. Kasia. He nodded, eyes closing again. Your girls are warm. Saved me. She didn't answer. Just tucked a blanket tighter around him and returned to the fire. That evening, after the girls fell asleep, Kasia stared at Nima's face in the flickering light. There were fine lines at the edges of his mouth. His skin, once golden, now looked ash-gray. He had a scar across his cheekbone half buried beneath frostbite. He had coin, clearly. His coat alone could trade for weeks of flour. But he had no horse, no gun, no trail. Who leaves a rich Apache to die in the snow? She didn't ask. She just watched. When she finally let herself sleep, it was with one ear open. One eye half shut. One arm resting across the girl's. Nima didn't move. By the second morning, he was stronger. He sat up. He took soup in small sips. He watched the girls laugh over nothing, twirling in their worn socks like spring had come early. He didn't smile. But something shifted in his face, like a door cracking open. Mama, Trilly whispered, tugging on Kasia's apron. I think he's staying. Kasia didn't reply. Outside, the snow kept falling quiet and soft. But something in the air had changed. And Kasia, for the first time in months, didn't feel quite so alone. Not safe. Not sure. Just, not alone. And sometimes, that was enough. Especially when the wind wouldn't stop whispering. Especially when the town never came looking. Especially when the fire only lasted as long as the wood. He was alive now. And that would complicate everything. The wind calmed for a day, just enough to let the woodpile breathe and the girls play without wrapping themselves like old onions in quilts. Nima stayed on the floor near the hearth, back propped against the wall, legs stiff as a board beneath layers of worn cloth and stitched leather. His fever had broken, but not the silence between him and the world. He watched everything. Every breath Kasia took, every flick of the girl's fingers, every sound the cabin made when dusk settled in. He was learning them. Kasia said little. Her hands worked endlessly washing, kneading dough, sewing buttons where none had been before. If he caught her looking at him, she always looked away first. She kept her distance like she was bracing for something that might not hurt but might leave a bruise. Nima didn't ask why she'd saved him. And Kasia didn't ask where he'd come from. But the questions hung in the space between them like smoke that couldn't find a window. On the third morning, Nima asked, "Do you ever go to town?" Kasia poured thin coffee into a tin cup and handed it to him. "Only when I have to." He took a sip, grimaced, and held the warmth against his lips like it might thaw something inside him. "Your girls speak like they ain't ever been taught fear." "They know it," she said quietly. "They just don't name it." He nodded, as if that answered something he hadn't dared ask. Later that day, while the girls napped in their pile of quilts, Kasia went to check the snares. She returned with a single rabbit and a face drawn tight from walking too long with empty hands. When she opened the door, she saw Nima trying to stand, gripping the table edge, his body rigid with pain. "You're not strong enough yet," she said, moving to him before she could talk herself out of it. He didn't argue. He just let her take his weight. He was heavier than he looked, and warm now, too warm. She helped him lower back to the blanket beside the fire. "I ain't a burden," he said. Kasia straightened. "I didn't say you were. You didn't have to." That night, he gave her a small pouch, leather, stitched fine, soft with use. "Silver. From my belt. We'll fetch food." Kasia didn't take it. "You need it," he insisted. She shook her head. "I didn't bring you in to rob you. It's not robbery if I give it." "I'm not your wife," she said, too sharply. He looked at her, then really looked. "Didn't ask you to be." And there it was. a bruise blooming between them. The next morning, Kasia woke to find Nima gone. Panic clenched her chest so hard she had to sit down. She rushed to the door, half expecting to see blood on the snow or a trail of wolf prints leading away. But instead, she saw him walking. Limping, more like it. Down the trail toward town. Alone. No coat. She didn't follow. But her hands shook the whole time she waited. When he returned near dusk, he carried a sack of goods, dried beans, bandages, flour, and a small tin of salve. The girls ran to him like he was Santa himself. "Where'd you go?" Kasia asked, not unkindly, just raw. "Town," he said. "They weren't glad to see me." "What did you say to get what you needed?" "Didn't say much. Just that it was for the widow." Kasia stared at him. "You don't even know my full name." "Don't need to." "They do." Later, she found herself pacing. Not from anger. From something harder to name, fear wrapped in warmth. She was used to surviving. But not to being seen. That night, the girls danced around the room with crusts of bread in their mouths, crumbs tumbling down their chins, hair tangled like wildflowers. Kasia sat at the table with needle in hand, pretending not to watch Nima as he wrapped his leg with the new bandage. "You didn't know me that trip," she said. "You didn't know me, you're fire," he replied. The silence after felt less like tension and more like space being made. By the end of the week, town gossip had found its way back to the hills. Mrs. Ebacroyle, the self-appointed voice of virtue, had seen Nima in town, had seen him buy salve, had seen him speak to the clerk without hat in hand. She told Pastor Marsh that the Briggs widow had taken in a stranger and was playing wife in every way that matters. The pastor hadn't responded. But that silence, too, could be twisted. Kasia heard about it from a peddler passing by with a broken wheel and loose lips. "Said you were housing sin," he muttered, chewing a matchstick. "Said you were letting Apache gold pay for settler bread." Kasia said nothing. But that night, when Nima stepped out to check the wind, she watched him from the doorway. He looked like a man who'd stopped needing the world's approval long ago. He held still like a tree holds still only because it has nowhere else to grow. He caught her watching and said, "I can leave if they come sniffing." Kasia shook her head. "They never sniff this far. Just bark from their porches." He smiled. The first real one she'd seen. It was small. Crooked. But real. Inside, the fire cracked and the girls giggled in their sleep, dreaming of things children dream when they are warm for the first time in weeks. Kasia leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed, chin lifted. She didn't say thank you. And he didn't say stay. But the next morning, he built the fire before she rose. He used the last of the good kindling. And when she came out with sleep still clinging to her eyes, he handed her the first full cup of coffee she hadn't made herself in over a year. There was no talk of debts. No mention of repayment. Just quiet. And the kind of peace that settles not with ceremony, but with the simplest gesture, a man lighting another's hearth before his own. Spring had not come, but the snow had softened. Water trickled from the edge of the roof like breath from a sleeping mouth, and the earth beneath the trees had started to show its bones. The cold still lingered, but it no longer bit, it watched. Inside the cabin, the floor no longer creaked with dread. Nima had carved a cradle from the old broken stool, and the triplets used it for their dolls, 3 cornhusk girls in patched dresses, each with names that changed by the hour. Kasia let them play as long as they stayed warm. There was flour now, enough to make flatbread 3 days in a row, and a bit of meat from the snare she'd found near the ridge. Nima's leg had begun to heal. He walked with a limp, slower than the girls liked, but he could carry a sack of wood across the room without breath hitching. He spoke more now, though his voice still came like smoke, low, curling, and steady. He didn't ask for space, and she didn't offer it. They lived like two people trying not to leave fingerprints on one another, but leaving them anyway. One morning, Marnie fell sick. Her cheeks burned and her small body curled like paper near the fire. Kasia fed her broth and pressed damp cloths to her head, but her eyes stayed glassy. "I'll go," Nima said. "You can't," Kasia answered. Your leg's not right. And the town's colder than this cabin. I'll go, he repeated. She stared at him. His coat was still damp from last night's snow. The boots were worn now, stitched with her thread. His hand shook slightly as he pulled his belt tight. He didn't wait for her permission. Nima rode into town that day on a borrowed mule from a neighbor he barely knew. The wind tore at his coat, and every jolt made his jaw clench. When he arrived, he asked for the apothecary, but the man refused to serve him. You think your coin changes what you are, the man said. She saved you. Don't mean she belongs with you. Nima said nothing. He turned to go, but then Pastor Eldon Marsh stepped forward from the doorway of the chapel, his gray coat drawn tight, eyes clear. She has 3 daughters, the pastor said softly. And you rode through a storm for one of them. I would again, Nima said. Marsh nodded once. Then come with me. The pastor gave him herbs, instructions, even a wool blanket for the child. He said nothing else. But he watched Nima as if he were watching a future he hadn't expected. By nightfall, Nima returned, face windburnt, arms full. Marnie slept more peacefully by morning. Her fever broke. The triplets clung to him after, each asking what the town looked like, what candy he saw, if the church bells still rang. Kasia watched from the stove. She said nothing. But she set an extra plate for him that night. He sat beside her as the girls dozed off one by one. The firelight danced across his scar. Why do you do it? She asked finally. What? Stay. Nima didn't speak for a long moment. Then, I buried my wife with my sons. That was 2 winters ago. I built a fence around her grave, then stopped speaking to the world. But you, he glanced at her. You didn't ask what I'd lost. You just gave me what was left of what you had. Kasia looked down at her hands, fingers red from flour and scrubbing. I gave you scraps, she murmured. You gave me warmth. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the wind brushing against the windowpane like a child asking to be let in. The next few days passed gently. Kasia found herself waking earlier, brushing her hair again. Nima taught the girls how to cut kindling without splintering their fingers. Trilly sang while she worked. Flora made up stories about prairie hens and invisible bears. But peace doesn't last long in a place where people need something to whisper about. Mrs. Ebba Croyle came riding with 2 other women from the sewing circle. They stayed on their horses, faces pinched, lips pursed. She called out from the gate like she was announcing a flood. Kasia Briggs, we've come for your girls. Kasia stepped onto the porch slowly, skirt dusted with flour, hands still damp from bread dough. What do you mean? She asked. They're in danger, Croyle said. It's been talked over. You've taken in a man not your kin. An Apache. You live together. No ring. No respect. My girls are warm. Federal alive. They're growing up wrong. Sin doesn't always look wicked. Kasia didn't flinch. Neither does pride. Croyle leaned forward in her saddle. Pastor Marsh said nothing when I told him. But I will not have this filth infecting our town. Kasia's voice was steady. Then stay out of it. Croyle opened her mouth again, but Nima stepped out beside Kasia, silent as a winter tree. He said nothing. But his presence shifted something. One of the other women turned her horse away. The wind picked up. Kasia stood tall. Croyle looked between them, her lips curling. This isn't over. Kasia didn't reply. They left in a clatter of reins and brittle righteousness. That evening, Kasia didn't cook in silence. She sang a lullaby from before her husband's death, low, almost shy. The girls hummed along without knowing the words. Nima carved something small by the fire, a bird with outstretched wings from a pine scrap. He didn't hand it to anyone. He just set it on the mantel. Later, after the girls were tucked in, he stood near the hearth, back to her. They'll come again. I know. I could leave, he offered. Kasia stepped forward. Her voice came softer than it ever had. They'd still whisper. Only now I'd be alone when they did. He turned to her, eyes searching. And now? She looked down. Now I'm not. She didn't touch him. She didn't need to. The space between them had become a vow. The fire burned low, but the warmth stayed. And the wind, for once, didn't press at the walls like an enemy, but like a witness. The thaw had begun in earnest. The snow melted into the ground like a secret being swallowed, and the trees, once brittle and hunched, stood taller again, their limbs dark and damp with memory. The creek near Cash's cabin cracked open its frozen skin and began to run. Not fast, not proud, but alive. Kasha found herself stepping outside more often, sweeping the porch with a borrowed broom, brushing stray hairs from the girls' faces with a tenderness that surprised even her. She still measured out every scoop of flour and rationed soap as though scarcity were a permanent guest, but something in her posture had changed. She no longer walked like a woman bracing for a blow. She stood with a quieter sort of armor earned, not worn. Nima chopped wood now. Not much. Just enough to show he could. The limp remained, but it moved with him like a part of him, not a wound, but a truth he carried. His voice came easier now, especially with the girls, who buzzed around him like bees to smoke. He let them braid his hair unevenly. Let them ask about rivers and horses and stars. He told them what he knew, and when he didn't, he told them stories anyway. The whispers from town thickened, no longer the faint breeze of idle gossip, but the cutting wind of judgment. Twice, Kasha found notes on the fence. Scraps of paper held by stones, words scrawled in a bitter, self-righteous hand, "Shame on you. White woman should know better. Those girls will pay." Kasha didn't show them to Nima. She burned them in the stove without a word. But she began to lock the door at night. One morning, Pastor Eldon Marsh came by unannounced. He stood at the fence with his hat in hand, the kind of man who rarely imposed but came when the Spirit whispered. Kasha met him on the porch. Her dress was faded but clean, apron smoothed down with palms. She didn't offer him tea. She didn't have enough to spare. "I've come," he said gently, "because there's talk of petitioning the county to intervene. Some believe the children are in a compromised home. They're wrong. I know. But that doesn't quiet them." "Does it matter that he's kind?" she asked, chin lifting. "That he rode through a storm to save Marnie? That he's never raised his voice or his hand?" Marsh's expression softened. "It should. Does it matter that we're not starving anymore?" He paused, thumb smoothing the brim of his hat. "There's power in papers, Kasha. In names. In rings." She looked out toward the trees, where the girls were gathering fallen branches. "So we perform respectability like a play? Even when kindness already lives here?" The pastor said nothing. Before he left, he added softly, "If you did marry, there'd be less room for cruelty." Kasha nodded once. Understood. That night, after the girls were asleep, Kasha sat by the fire with Nima, their chairs close, their silence companionable. He was whittling again, this time a small fox, its tail curling around its paws. "I had a visitor," she said. He glanced up. "From town?" "Pastor Marsh." "What did he want?" Kasha folded her hands in her lap. "To warn me. They're coming after the girls. Unless something changes." Nima's eyes darkened. "They wouldn't take them." "They'll try. Maybe not tomorrow. But they're circling." He stood, slowly, knee clicking as he straightened. "I'll leave." She stood too. "No." He met her gaze, jaw taut. "If I'm the reason." "You're the reason Marnie's alive. The reason they laugh again. They braid your hair, Nima. They sleep without fear." He swallowed, hands at his sides. "Then what do we do?" She didn't answer right away. She walked to the window, looked out into the deep black of the night, where trees whispered like women at a well. Finally, she turned to him. "I won't let them call this sin. I won't let them name love something ugly just because it doesn't wear a ring. He took a slow step toward her. Do you want to marry me, Kasha Briggs? She didn't smile. Didn't cry. I want to protect them. I want to stay warm. I want to wake up to something that isn't fear. Then let's do it, he said. No town. No church. No one's eyes but ours. They married the next evening, in the clearing behind the cabin, with the girls carrying pine cones instead of flowers. Pastor Marsh came, quiet and soft-spoken, with a linen Bible in trembling hands. Kasha wore the same dress she'd buried her husband in. Nima wore his coat, cleaned and patched. They stood beneath the bare-limbed trees, the melting snow beneath their boots making soft sucking sounds as if the earth itself was trying to listen. I pronounce you, Marsh said, voice nearly lost in the wind. Husband and wife. There were no kisses. No laughter. Just Kasha reaching for Nima's hand, and Nima not letting go. After the pastor left, they sat on the porch with the girls curled beside them, watching the sun go down in colors only winter could paint: rose gold, deep plum, faint silver. Kasha looked at her new husband and said, simply, "They'll talk." He nodded. Let them. The fire burned strong that night. Not high, but steady. Like a promise. Like something no longer asking for permission to exist. Outside, the trees bent in the wind, not from fear, but from grace. The snow was long gone now, leaving behind a soft, damp earth and the quiet hum of spring pressing in through every open window. Grass had begun to peek through the forest floor like shy children, and the cabin, once brittle with silence, now breathed with warmth, with meals that didn't end in hunger, with footsteps that no longer hesitated. Kasha stood at the porch rail in a dress no longer patched but hand-sewn anew, her girls running barefoot in the field, skirts flying behind them like wildflower flags. Trilly carried a bundle of twigs on her head like a crown. Flora chased butterflies with a wooden spoon. Marnie squatted near the creek, whispering to frogs. They were dirty and alive and laughing. Nima was by the barn, hammering new shingles into place, his limp more rhythm than injury now. The sound of his work echoed down the valley, steady, sure. Kasha watched him with the softest kind of awe, the kind born not of grand gestures but of a man who simply stayed. But peace in the West never stood too long without being tested. They came just before sundown. A wagon, a sheriff, and 3 town matrons, Mrs. Croyle among them, stopped just outside the cabin gate like they were arriving at a gallows. The sheriff stepped down first, puffed up like a rooster, badge polished like a coin too eager to shine. Kasha's girls froze in the field. One by one, they turned and walked back toward the cabin, silent now, skirts muddy, eyes wide. Kasha stepped off the porch to meet them before her children could reach her. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, touching the brim of his hat like courtesy could excuse cruelty. "We've had a petition." Kasha didn't flinch. "You've had gossip." Mrs. Croyle stepped forward, clutching a folded piece of paper like scripture. "We've seen the children unattended, sickly. We've seen you live with a man not of your race, not of your kind. There are rules. Rules that keep the cold alive and the kind quiet," Kasha replied, voice even. "She's not even ashamed," another woman muttered. Nemo walked up behind Kasha then, slow and calm, wiping his hands on a rag, hammer still tucked into his belt. The sheriff tensed. "Sir, I'll ask you to keep your distance." Nima ignored him. "These girls saved my life." "No one doubts your recovery," Croyle sneered. "It's the morality we question." Kasha stepped closer to her. "You think you can take them? You think signing your name on a piece of paper gives you the right to undo what we've built? But you don't see the nights they cried themselves to sleep. You didn't bring fever down with snowpacks and prayers. You weren't here when they almost starved." The sheriff cleared his throat, uncomfortable now. "Let's not make this a scene, ma'am." But it already was. Neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the dust of the wagon wheels and the raised voices. Quiet men with arms crossed. Women holding baskets, pretending to pick herbs just to listen. Nima took one step forward. "If you lay one hand on them, there will be blood." Kasha didn't touch him, but her voice steadied him. "No. Let me. She turned to the gathering crowd. You know me. I was raised here. Married here. Buried a husband in the flood that took your fences. I've sewn for half your children. I've mended your shirts. You didn't call me unfit then. Because you weren't living in sin then, Croyle spat. Kasia pointed to her daughters. You see sin, I see salvation. You see a man with a darker face, I see the only one who came when my daughter was dying. You gossip while he carried her 20 miles through snow. The crowd shifted. Eyes dropped. No one moved. Pastor Marsh appeared then, walking alone from the trail, coat swinging in the wind. He stopped beside the sheriff, spoke low but firm. You've no authority to remove children without formal charge. And I performed their vows myself. Their husband and wife. Let it be. Croyle turned on him, voice shrill. You married them? You enabled this? He looked at her with the tired sadness of a man who had seen too much. I saw love. And a man worth more than the silence you'd prefer. The sheriff looked around, now aware that the crowd had not turned in his favor. This was a waste of time, he muttered. Let's go. But before they could leave, Kasia stepped forward, voice low and rich with finality. No more notes. No more visits. You want to judge, do it from your porches. But come near my daughters again, and I will not speak, I will act. Nima laid a hand on her back then. Not to silence her. To stand with her. The wagon turned. One by one, the townsfolk drifted back into the trees and hills, carrying with them a different story than the one they came for. That night, the girls curled in bed without asking questions. Peace had not returned. It had been fought for. Earned. Kasia sat on the porch with Nima beside her, their hands twined, faces turned to the stars. I was ready to burn it all down, he said. You didn't have to, she whispered. The truth was enough. In the distance, coyotes cried and were answered by silence. Nima turned to her. They'll talk still. Let them. You sure you're not ashamed? She met his eyes, soft and fierce. No. Because you didn't give me gold. You gave me mourning. You gave them laughter. He leaned in, kissed her hand, kissed the scar where the cold had once cracked her knuckles. You gave me a reason. And as the night deepened, the trees stood guard, and the fire inside burned low but proud. Kasia watched her daughters sleep through the window. Watched the man beside her breathe steady. And in her heart, she planted a single, quiet truth: the West did not belong to those who spoke loudest. It belonged to those who stayed. Who built. Who dared to love in a place that did not teach it. And she had loved. Enough to hold on. Enough to stay. Enough to never apologize for choosing warmth over fear. And in that warmth, the world changed.